Hi, I'm Matt Norris. Welcome to this video where I will be talking about some art theory. So today I will be going through my understanding of Gestalts and form articulation in oil paintings. These ideas were largely conceived of while exploring the term Gestalt. This video is probably for people who are interested in abstract ideas about oil painting theory. I'll be covering some art fundamentals and making some points while referencing some of my own artwork. My experience painting seemed to lead more towards a focus on things like Gestalts and form articulation, which perhaps seemed to be playing more of a role in my early artwork than I originally figured. So, elements and principles. This is how I'd summarize these things if I were leaning more towards the textbook type description. This is just going to be a really brief overview. So, elements are somewhat simple. They are the different sorts of pieces that are at play when you're putting a painting together. They're kind of like your ingredients. And if elements are ingredients, then principles then describe how these ingredients tend to work together. Techniques involve how the paint itself is handled and applied onto the surface. Style then starts to concern how a person brings all of these things together. And if we move into making a more complete food type analogy, then the composition is like the actual recipe, the exact thing you are wanting to make. So that was just a quick summary of some key painting concepts. Now I'll move on to the more meat and potatoes part of the video. So during around 2012-2013, I began to paint often as a hobby. I was interested in the visual arts, paintings and film, but upon taking up oil painting as a hobby, I was quite taken aback by the beauty of the painted surface, which I was now in a position to see from a very up-close perspective. My own paintings were really the first that I'd ever actually really looked at closely. This was enhanced though because my vantage point as the painter also allowed me to see the painting surface change and develop. Access to a kind of visual dopamine experience became available when seeing unresolved or poorly performing parts of the painting have that moment in which they evolve, perhaps with just a single brushstroke, into becoming something that is really now working for the painting effectively. Now, I had heard people use photorealism as a compliment, as though that was some be-all and end-all, and even though I kind of understand that, once you really encounter the painted surface, you can start to see all sorts of beautiful things that a photo doesn't quite have. As I trialed or incorporated different painting techniques, I began to strongly consider paintings as having the ability to transcend photos, at least or especially in certain aspects. Things depicting space or texture in a more visceral way, in a way which may not be realistic in terms of detail like a photo, but realistic in terms of the experience of seeing it. A spatial effect effective enough that it can be felt, for instance. I began to develop an attitude that what people might actually mean when they say photorealistic is really realistic in terms of detail. But there can be a painting that captures texture, say, or space in a way that is actually quite realistic, despite the fact that detail itself being not photorealistic. So I developed a leaning towards painting forms that had great tactility, surfaces that had bite, and scenes with a pronounced spatial effect. Basically, I decided not to compete with and lose against photos and their detail realism, but instead I decided to depict what photos are weaker at, to play to the strengths of a painting, as it were. So bear in mind, I didn't have painting lessons, and often I really was just throwing mud at the wall, so to speak. Although I did draw throughout my life, so I had some skill development in different areas. The point is that I had a bit of a goal, but I didn't have a developed approach that would allow me to quickly and effectively execute it. Hence, a painting that I was working on often involved a fair degree of trial and error. Not all paintings of mine had this to the same extent, but it did happen to a fair extent. Now around mid-2017, came up with a bit of a strategy or maybe strategic painting style. I had observed that in several paintings of mine I had often played with and reworked a particular form, adding various brushstrokes in an attempt to resolve that form just right and that sometimes this might make for a bit of a speckly mess, as I cut in some bits of colour or cut in some bits of sharp texture, all in an effort to try and get an overall effect that I was aiming for, but through trial and error. So the new style I came up with simply involved the idea of leaning in towards a speckly look overall generally, so that all of those adjustment speckles that I was adding to fix the different forms would simply blend in. They'd seem part of the style. A speckly style to mask the speckly adjustments that I was needing to make. And I called this style Speckelation. When exploring concepts firsthand, I do like to make up my own terminology. Perhaps it invites a certain play element. Perhaps using more official terminology invites the sensation that the concept is thus grasped, when really it might not be. I like to keep the terminology field original and somewhat in flux so that it can reflect my level of understanding regarding the particular field of inquiry. As I dial into a more ultimate and resolved take on a particular concept, I can then start to sharpen the language, or even then adopt more official terminology, but only once I've explored the idea and know the actual relevance of these words. Also, my use of original terminology might serve as a kind of subtle and earnest reminder to the viewer that I'm not spouting an official or professional doctrine, but instead I'm describing my own experiences, exploring these ideas, and developing my own perspectives. So here is the first of my speculated paintings, The Biggest Tadpole 2017. Give everything a speckled appearance so that the speckled reworking of areas can just blend into the conveniently speckled style. And in keeping with the theory, I reworked the areas of this painting a lot over several months. I was really just throwing mud at the wall though, seeing, not even really knowing what sticks, but just seeing what it all looks like. Seeing an object form as a mass of speckles, becoming somewhat unified within itself perhaps, but not often unified with how other objects were forming. Then deliberately disturbing that unity, returning that object to a state of mess or flux, so that another attempt could be made to again assemble those elements and resolve the form of the object again in a different, hopefully better way. I was already at this point interested in space and was somewhat using the successful or unsuccessful achievement of a spatial effect by each object as it formed as one of the signs of a successful forming of that object. But yeah, things would happen like different objects might form well in their own right, but with significant differences in, say, their clarity or how bright or muted their colours were. Like this plant might form well, but in a way where it looks as though it's from a different painting, not consistent with how the things of this painting look. But then what even is the way that things in this painting were supposed to look? Well, that was the sort of stuff that I was sort of playing with. Watching as objects went from a state of flux to a state of resolution, all in a fairly loose and uncontrolled manner, until eventually I somewhat managed to unify the whole painting to some reasonable extent. In the process I laid down quite a substantial thickness of paint. This troll in the foreground has a head that is almost sculpture-like when seen up close. Quick aside here concerning the story of this painting. So a group of trolls are looking at the tadpoles in this pond, and we see this troll on the right telling the one at the back that the biggest tadpole in the pond is right here at the front, in front of this rock. The troll at the back will fall into the pond attempting to see it. Though there was never a tadpole in front of this rock at all, it was just a ruse. An interesting take on the idea is that once this happens, the troll that falls in will actually sort of become the biggest tadpole in the pond. Kind of half-truth, I told you so. There's a playing out of a dramatic potential here. The final act of the troll falling in kind of completes that circle. This troll on the rock up here appears to be willing that outcome for that circle to become complete. And looking at this story through the lens of my obscured reality model, which I introduced in my first Bible oil painting video, The Raised Hand of John the Baptist, there is a complete full circle drama here that is at the point in the story with the back troll teetering where it's in a kind of fragmented state. In that first video, we mostly looked at physical objects being obscured. Here it is a drama or story. We also looked at how, when presented with obscured forms, the mind might try to fill in the gaps and make a complete picture out of what's available. This story here with the trolls seems to have some of these aspects present and a kind of beckoning of reality to manifest into this whole picture, to physically make a fragmented, obscured form complete. It seems to be an instant where that can happen. Interesting. And maybe one day I will show you the other painting I did of two trolls where one offers the other one a glass of orange juice. Anyway, after playing with the surface of this painting for many months, I ended up being able to somewhat resolve each object in a somewhat consistent way. There is some sense of space in this painting. The main thing I ended up focusing on was how this troll appeared in front of this rock in his immediate background, to try and remember the effectiveness of having a foreground style and a background style. How do all these elements or speckles form in the foreground, and how do they form in the background object, and so on. So my first attempt here at so-called speculation. So, something which I've begun to explore much more recently is the term Gestalt. The definition I originally found on the internet was along the lines of an organized whole that is perceived as more than the sum of its parts. Now here I'll explore my entry-level attempt to kind of try and understand the term, and then later we'll look at how that understanding has begun to develop. Now the first thing that came to mind was that perhaps a gestalt is like a net effect. For example, if you look up at the sky, you may see a galaxy, but from such a distance, rather than seeing the detail of the galaxy, you would just see the net effect of the galaxy, a single star, like a dot of light. Or imagine that an alien in a ship is looking at a planet from orbit. Over the course of a year, they may see a large green area of that planet turn orange and then turn green again. Suppose those aliens are looking at a forest, but from their vantage point, the whole complicated forest structure is simply seen as just an area of the planet that changes colour. So the net effect of the forest from the vantage point of the aliens is just a big colour changing shape. Now, in viewing something complicated like a forest, for instance, from an up-close and personal vantage point, the word impression might be more useful than net effect, because when up close and personal to a complicated thing, the possibility emerges for having various impressions of that thing. The forest at one instance may appear as something that is providing a great supply of sustenance, but at another instance it may be a thing of terrible danger. Similarly, when engaging with a person, they are complicated to a point that you could never apprehend all of them. You may get various different impressions, different snapshots of the whole. So this is kind of how I was initially regarding the word gestalt upon initially reading that dictionary definition, considering it in terms of a net effect or impression of something complicated. I'm going to use this painting here to make some further points about the term gestalts. This painting is The Time That the Big Lizard Made Itself at Home in the Goblin Village, 2018. Shows the different attempts being made by the goblins to displace the unwelcome big lizard. Evidently, I was going through a bit of a fairy tale phase at the time. Now, I mentioned in the beginning of this video that elements are kind of like the ingredients of a painting. So let's zoom in at a section of this painting to see some of those elements up close. Immediately, perhaps you can see that the elements are not so independently and cleanly discernible. So when I attempted to define the form of the lizard's leg here, you can see that I made the kind of speckulated surface. But what are these speckles really? Here we have an instant of transparency, and here we have an instant of tactile opaque texture, and here we have an instant of colour. The whole leg form here is made up of these different elemental instances. Let's consider that elements, as I described at the start of the video, don't really exist in reality. They are theoretical only. This is because they are never singularly divisible. You can't have the element of colour without also having the instant of colour bounded by shape and size. No element is singularly divisible. It is itself a compound of sorts, and a mark or instance on a canvas, for instance these instances of transparency, tactile opaque texture, and colour, are actually what might be thought of as kinds of gestaltic elemental compounds. Now firstly, gestaltic isn't a word, But I'm far from understanding the whole concept of Gestalts in full, so bear with me as I play with the term. Now, this idea is especially true in oil paintings and is handy to know because really, based on a painter's approach to a painting, these are actually more so what they have to work with as ingredients. When doing a speculated painting like this, it is really a chance to actually just see what sorts of instances or gestaltic elemental compounds there may actually be in the painting and what ones are possible to create. And when I was reworking areas of a painting in that kind of throwing mud at the wall to see what sticks, I was really cutting in different ones of these instances or speckles or gestaltic elemental compounds. So in terms of forming an understanding of an oil painting through a Gestalt framework, we might consider this following model. So we see in my lizard painting example that through the application of paint, different instances are created, tiny moments of great complexity, but with a more singular expression or net effect or gestalt. At the smallest scale, the elemental scale, say, we have gestaltic elemental compounds. Now at a larger scale, the scale of the lizard's leg for instance, or the whole lizard, we have a form that is made up of these gestaltic elemental compounds, but the way that these compounds come together also creates a gestalt, but a more complicated and larger form that has shape and that has an interplay with light and space and may include aspects of texture, a whole multitude of different aspects. So where gestaltic elemental compounds have a more singular gestalt, gestaltic form compounds have a much more varied and complex gestalt, the gestalt of a seemingly three-dimensional object. Now, at a greater scale, at a greater level of complexity still, we have the greater gestalt created by the individual forms of the whole painting. An example of such a greater gestalt might be the appearance of an overall spatial effect that might even appear to include an atmosphere that is at play throughout the whole painting. So here we have greater gestalts at the scale of the whole composition, like space, created by forms that are themselves gestalts created by elemental compounds themselves made from the raw markings of paint on the canvas. So all of this would constitute a kind of nested gestalts model, which is interesting. The appearance at one scale is due to the combined effect of parts from a smaller scale, whose appearance themselves is due to the effects of smaller parts, and so on, a kind of fractal regression all of the way down. So now a painting from a few years later, We Are Not Alone, 2022, more of a sci-fi fantasy phase. I think that this painting has a pretty good spatial effect, more or less what I'm typically aiming for. Conceptually, I treat the different objects within the painting as though they are kinds of markers in space. How they appear should reflect how far into the painting they are. If all of the objects within a painting follow that idea in a consistent manner, then a spatial effect can be created. So how an object within the painting is painted is directly based on its spatial positioning within the painting. Something though that stood out to me when looking back at this painting was that there are perhaps excessive levels of speculation here in parts. The whole purpose of the speculation strategic style was to mask all of the alterations that I, a novice, would be making. But here in this painting, I basically painted each part once and didn't need to perform any reworking or adjustment. So perhaps, that being the case, there may be a bit of a redundancy in the use of speculation here. As I learn to be able to hit the mark more directly, I don't actually need a speckly look to mask subsequent changes because there won't be any. Since this painting, there has been a general shift towards a more seamless, less overtly speckled appearance to the objects within my paintings. So taking all of this into account and what I learnt and talked about in terms of the nested Gestalts model, I began to consider that what I originally called speculation might also be thought of as the creation of an expressed gestaltic form articulation field, which across time is moving towards a more seamless gestaltic form articulation field. The speculated style might be thought of as a way to help the painter see the building blocks more clearly so that they can grasp and maneuver them better. But as the painter becomes more adept at doing so, they can kind of close up that space, or at least continue to make adjustments but in a more subtle, seamless way. Perhaps an analogy would be going from playing with big, easy to handle Duplo blocks to the more difficult to handle and fine Lego blocks. So that was what I came up with when trying to explore the term Gestalt. I think that an understanding of Gestalts and form articulation really helped with my gaining a kind of clarity with regard to what I was kind of doing within these earlier paintings of mine. So I hope you found that interesting. If you did, don't forget to like, share and subscribe. Thanks for listening. See you next time.